Look, if you are serving in a military, in a democracy, and the democratically elected government passes a law, it's not a military officer or combat soldier or fighter pilots. It's not their province to say, I'm not going to serve. I mean, if you're legally allowed to quit, okay, you quit. But this is dangerous when a military says, I won't obey the orders of the democratically elected government. That's a risk to democracy.
We begin tonight with the raging battle over judicial reform in Israel, one that reached a fevered pitch this week. On Monday, the Knesset passed the first in a series of reforms offered by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This one prevents Israeli judges, including justices on the High Court, from using a vague and undefined concept known as a reasonableness standards to strike down and cancel laws, administrative decisions, and political appointments passed by an Israeli government and/or made by the Prime Minister. Netanyahu and his allies argue that for years, Israeli judges, and especially justices on the Supreme Court, have engaged in an extreme form of left-wing judicial activism, striking down decisions by democratically elected right-wing governments that they deem as unreasonable. Yet Netanyahu notes that there is literally no law on the books that gives judges such power, much less defines what is reasonable and what is not. The opposition, led by Yair Lapid, denounces the new law as, quote, the end of democracy, saying the measure prevents the High Court from being a much-needed check and balance on the government. Yet just a few years ago, Lapid himself criticized the reasonableness standard as unreasonable.
I am against the judicial activism that was introduced by Judge Aaron Barak. In my opinion, not every issue should be judged. I think it is wrong that the court will change world order according to a reasonableness test, a completely obscure, subjective definition that the Knesset has never turned into law.
The moment the law passed on Monday, protests erupted across the country. Protesters blocked main highways, lit fires in the streets, and clashed with police who arrested dozens and used water cannons to disperse the crowds. At the same time, unions declared nationwide strikes, shutting down whole sectors of the economy to protest the new law. A shocking poll finds that 28% of Israelis are considering leaving the country over these new reforms. And more than 10,000 officers and soldiers in the IDF, including more than 1,000 in the Air Force, announced they would refuse to serve to defend a country that they say is abandoning democracy and heading towards a dictatorship. President Biden also sharply criticized the new law and continues to refuse to invite Netanyahu to the White House as a show of his displeasure. As the crisis escalated, All Israel News founder and Rosenberg Report host Joel Rosenberg, traveling on assignment in the U.S. and Canada this month, appeared on various shows to explain what's happening and why it matters.
Joining us now is Joel Rosenberg, host of the Rosenberg Report right here on TBN and author of The Libyan Diversion. Joel, welcome to the show. It's great to see you this evening.
Thank you, Lindsay. It's great to be on my first time since you took over the anchor desk. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so a serious topic with you here this evening. It seems like Israel is in what most people are calling one of the worst crises it has ever seen since its history. How bad is it?
Well, Lindsay, unfortunately, Israel, I think, is in its darkest hour of internal division since the modern founding of the country in May of 1948. That's bad. We've faced all kinds of external crises from day one, minute one of Israel in 1948, the invasion by 7 Arab nations. And then, of course, in 1956 and 67 and 73 and 82 and on, people trying to attack us from the outside. But what's happening now is tremendous internal division. It is a former prime minister of Israel just yesterday said it is bringing the country to the brink of civil war.
And is it? Do you think that it will go to a civil war?
Well, no, I don't think that. But could violence break out? Yes, it could. That's what worries me and worries others. There's no question there are hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, which would be a big deal in any American city. But if you talk about a country of only 10 million citizens, when you have, 400,000 to 500,000 people on the streets, this is huge. But here's the central issue. And I would call on every evangelical Christian to be praying right now for the peace of Jerusalem and for all Israelis. that the Lord would superintend some sort of calming measure here, because what Prime Minister Netanyahu is pursuing, Lindsay, is not unreasonable. The bill is called a reasonableness standard law. What does that mean? It means that the judicial high court, that the judges in Israel can't go crazy and just shoot things down that the government has passed legally because the court thinks it's unreasonable. That's unreasonable. There's literally no statute in the Israeli law that gives the high court the right to strike down an appointment or some other governmental decision based on it being unreasonable. That's a pretty broad definition. It means whatever the values and judicial perspective of those 9 justices is, that then is unreasonable. Well, if the law doesn't say you can't do it, why can't the prime minister appoint someone that he thinks is reasonable to a cabinet position or whatever? So this is judicial activism and overreach on steroids. And this is a small bill that begins to dial that back. It's not the whole reform package, some of which I actually disagree with, but this one seems pretty reasonable.
Rosenberg also appeared on CBN's Faith Nation to address the serious threat by Israeli soldiers and military officers not showing up for duty.
Look, if you are serving in a military in a democracy and the democratically elected government passes a law, it's not a military officer or combat soldier or fighter pilots. It's not their province to say, I'm not going to serve. I mean, if you're legally allowed to quit, okay, you quit. But this is dangerous when a military says, I won't obey the orders of the democratically elected government. That's a risk to democracy.
All this is happening during the saddest week on the Jewish calendar. Today, Israelis mark Tisha B'Av, the day in which Jews mourn and fast in memory of the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of both the first and the second holy temples. Jewish sages have traditionally blamed these twin tragedies on baseless hatred among the Jewish people. In Hebrew, they call it sinat chinam. And now, once again, Israeli Jews are turning against each other as the country heads into dark and uncharted waters. So I join Joel in asking people to pray for Israel at this critical time. That said, it's not just in Israel where tectonic legal battles are underway. Here in the United States, the Supreme Court has handed down several huge and very positive decisions this summer, including those that dramatically strengthen religious liberty for Christians and Jews. To better understand what's happening and what lessons Israelis might be able to learn, Joel headed to Park City, Utah to sit down with Kelly Shackelford, an evangelical lawyer, founder of the nonprofit group First Liberty, and one of America's leading experts on legal reform.
Kelly Shackelford, thank you so much for sitting with the Rosenberg Report on TBN. Listen, I want to start with your assessment of where are we in terms of religious freedom right now, because Christians in this country feel very much under the gun, as it were. So, but you're an optimist, and so summarize where you think we are right now.
Well, I've been doing religious freedom work for 34 years, and the attacks are greater in the United States than we've ever seen, and that probably doesn't surprise most people. But because of the victories we're all of a sudden getting, and really in a dramatic way, and I can describe how that is in a second, but every American alive right now has more religious freedom than they've ever had in their lifetime. They might not understand it right now because they might not have caught up with what's happening, but the legal victories we're winning, we're shifting 50-year precedents, and God is literally opening whole swaths of religious freedom that nobody has ever seen in this country. And the question is really going to be, are we going to walk in it and exercise it? God's sort of taken the ground, but will we walk and take the ground ourselves that He's made available for us?
What's the most important case that you and your team have won at the Supreme Court in the past year or so that is evidence of how the ground is shifting?
Without a doubt, the biggest victory is the Coach Kennedy case. Coach Kennedy was a guy who came out of the military after 20 years of being a Marine and flipped on his TV, and he had been seen just earlier in the day. Somebody said, "Hey, would you be willing to come coach at the school?" And he's like thinking, I don't know anything about coaching. And he's like, all right, well, let me think about it. And so he's not a real religious guy, but he's prayed. He said, God, show me I don't know if I should do this. And that night he flips on the TV and there's this movie, Facing the Giants. And it's about Christians and coaches and praying. And it floored him because he never had a time where God really, he felt, spoke to him in such a direct way when he asked a specific question and got such an obvious answer. And so he said, okay, God, I'm going to make a pledge to you after every game. And that's what he did for 7 years, until the school district found out what he did after 7 years. And they came to him and they said, if you go to a knee again, we're going to fire you. And he went.
If he had gone to a Kaepernick knee during the national anthem, he would have probably been fine.
That's right.
I mean,
that's right. Yeah. But he was going to a knee to pray. And their big argument is some student might see him. And if they saw him, they might think maybe they should pray. And we can't have that. So we can have teachers and coaches being all kinds of bad examples. They can live lives that, really promote all kinds of things that are bad. But the one thing we can't allow is any citizen who's a coach or a teacher, or really even works for the government, to ever do anything that anybody would know is religious. And so we went to the Supreme Court, and he lost for 7 years because he was unfortunately
not at the Supreme Court, at other levels.
All the way up. Yeah, he's outside of Seattle. Okay. So we knew we had a very hostile court all the way up. The Ninth Circuit,
of legendary for how hostile it is.
Yes, but we got to the Supreme Court and we won.